Go. Next up, we've got Jonathan Spickerman. Jonathan is an Angular consultant who loves UI design, reactive programming, and teaching others to code. His background is in healthcare, but he loves front-end development no matter the industry. An active contributor to the Bitovi blog, he writes about Angular best practices and occasionally runs training sessions with other developers. Jonathan lives in Chicago and fills his free time with cycling and music production. We are so far 3 for 3 on cardio being a hobby today. That's pretty crazy. All right, Jonathan, come up on stage and take it away.
Cool. Hey, everyone. Like Andrew said, my name is Jonathan Spickerman. I'm a consultant here at Bitovi. Today, I'm going to be talking about how to supercharge your use of content projection in Angular with NG template. So, first of all, what do I even mean by content projection? So in Angular, content projection is a term to describe a technique for casting, air quotes, content into other components. So if you would imagine, a wall on your living room as one component, content projection is the means by which you project, let's say, a movie, which might be another component, onto your wall. Content projection is really well suited for content that is highly dynamic and is also very useful for creating reusable components. That's the use case that we're going to be talking about today. Content projection in Angular is implemented in two ways: ng content, which is the simpler of the two options, and then ng template, which is the more robust tool that we're going to be talking about today. So reusable components, this is the use case that we're going to focus on. These are a couple common examples of reusable components from a few different Angular component libraries. We've got a date picker from Bootstrap, some buttons from Angular Material, and a table from, I'm pretty sure it's PrimeNG. So reusable components bring consistency and a unified user experience to a product. They're also very useful for abstracting concepts, particularly concepts that are kind of hard to implement, like let's say a date picker. Lets developers leverage tools without necessarily having to worry about how those tools are implemented. These are extremely valuable, especially for large applications where you might have maybe hundreds of date pickers and in a single UI. But they can be a little bit challenging to build. There's always like a lot of corner cases you have to think about, but they are made quite a bit easier with content projection. So the use case that I'm talking about today is a drop-down menu. So imagine something that looks sort of like this. In this case, we have a drop-down menu with a list of pets in it. I'm a cat person myself. So our requirements for this feature, we need a reusable menu component that can be used to, let's say, display pets today, but maybe cars tomorrow, and maybe something that might not even be a list after that. A couple additional like reusability requirements here. The button text needs to be configurable because that is likely to change between uses, and then the menu should support multiple different types of content. And the nice litmus test for this, once we build this, since we're trying to make this with reusability in mind, this shouldn't require a lot of long-term maintenance to use or need to constantly have the hood popped as we use it for different features. This is something we really kind of want to build once and then have to sweat after that. So let's take a look at one option for how we might implement this, and then talk about the problems that content projection can help us solve. So this is kind of a basic example. We have our drop-down component here in this first snippet with a title input of type string and an items array that is any typed. We are binding the button text to this title member, which you can see on line 2 in that first HTML snippet. And then the contents of our row are being iterated over beneath that. And for each of our items in this array, we are adding an item into this drop-down menu div, and then setting this up by passing the pets here in this last example to the drop-down menu, and then passing an array of pets to show in the list. This is using some Bootstrap styles to do its styling. You can see we've got a drop-down menu here at the top, and then a second little inner div here for content. So this works well. This is the actual code that actually runs this little pets UI that I have here in the presentation. This is simple and easy to use, but it's fairly inflexible. The biggest downside, of course, is that this is an approach that really only works with numbers and strings, which does not necessarily cover all of the uses that we'll have. And we also don't have any control over the format of our content. These pet names are lowercased in data, and so they're lowercased in the UI, and we don't really have a way to change that. And wouldn't you know it, that's going to become a little bit of a problem. So let's say we get a new requirement from our product team, and we now need to capitalize all of our pet names. One solution to this is to use content projection, and the easiest way to get started with a content projection is with ng content. So if we look at the first code snippet there on line 3, you can see we still have our drop-down menu div, but now instead of a loop with some anchor tags, we simply have this ng content markup. So what this is doing is this is essentially leaving a hole in our template, basically drawing the white box and doing nothing else. And then we have to supply the content that goes into that box via this ng content, which you can see in the next snippet. So in the bottom snippet there, inside of our ng content component, we have added a container, which is iterating over our pets. And then for each pet, we are rendering an anchor tag with this dropdown item class. And then we are using the uppercase pipe, which is a pipe provided by Angular, to capitalize the pet names, as you can see in this little example. So for each one of these pets that we have in the array, our container is iterating over them and displaying them as an item. And this does have some improvements over the previous example. It meets our requirements, which is always, the biggest and most important pro in our list of pros and cons. And the rows that we have this does allow us to format our row in whatever way our product requirement might demand of us. And that is definitely a meaningful improvement. But there are some downsides as well. The most important one, I think, is that this really starts to break up the abstraction piece of this component. Whereas in the previous example, you didn't have to understand anything about how this menu was implemented in order to use it. Now you have to understand that this is a bootstrap dropdown, and bootstrap dropdowns render list items and anchor tags. And not only do you have to use an anchor tag, but you have to also add this dropdown item class right here. And that's a little bit of a problem, right? What if we, in addition to being more work on the individual developer, what happens if Bootstrap changes their menu classes? Or what happens if we decide that we don't want to use Bootstrap at all anymore? Now we have to go through and hunt down all of the places we're using this drop-down menu and update all of this markup. So that seems like maybe there might be a better option. And there is, and it's ng template. So in this case, this code example should look pretty familiar. There's not a ton of changes between these different examples, but the most notable one here is the addition of this of an additional input. You can see that on line 17 of that top code snippet. We now have an input called item template, which accepts a template reference. And this template reference is going to be the content for each of our row items. So we pass that in. And then if you look in the HTML on line 4, we have returned the anchor tag to our dropdown menu where it belongs, because this is, it's part of our dropdown menu, and it is using the styles that are needed for this particular CSS library. So it's back in the dropdown menu where it belongs. So we're looping over our items in our dropdown template again, but now instead of directly displaying the items from the array, we are simply adding an ng container and then adding a couple additional attributes to that, which are going to handle the rendering of our content. So the first one, if you look on line 6 there, is this ng template outlet. This is an Angular feature that provides an outlet for an ng template. Relatively self-explanatory. If it helps, you can think of this kind of like a router outlet in Angular, where this is essentially, again, this is just like an opening for you to place content of your choosing. The second thing that this container is doing, you'll notice on line 7, is adding an ng template outlet context. What this does is it's creating an embedded view. This is a concept in Angular that is definitely worthy of a deep dive, but maybe not today. But this is essentially, this is kind of like building out a little view, similar to how Angular builds views for components under the hood. The second piece of this is getting our data onto the screen. So right now we have a drop-down menu and the ability to pass it data, but we still aren't actually rendering anything. And that's going to happen at the container level. So the last step of that template outlet context, you'll notice on line 7 there in that middle bit of markup is this implicit, the $ implicit variable. What this is doing, this is where your bridge between your drop-down component and your embedded view back to your template starts to get put together. So the implicit variable gets passed to the ng template that you are passing in as your item template, and that is where the embedded view comes in. And in this case, we are setting the value of that implicit variable to the item that we are in our loop. So we're going to loop over all of our items, and then for every item in the array, we are going to set that to this implicit variable, which will get passed back to our ng template. On the usage side of that, in our container, in the bottom snippet, if you look on line 3, you'll see a let pet variable declaration. That is essentially grabbing the value of the implicit variable from the embedded view and setting it up in scope in this ng template, which we can then use in our template between those span tags to render out the name of our pet and then uppercase it. And voila, we have a capitalized list of pet names, no breaking up of our abstractions required. So this gives us an even better separation of concerns than the ng content solution provided for us. Our dropdown component is styling the rows in our menu while leaving the content of those rows up to the container. And that gives us quite a bit of flexibility. And it's a good thing that we have that flexibility, because now the backend has changed and our pets are objects. And this is really where the litmus test for reusability comes in. So imagine, if you will, that instead of an array of strings for pets, we have an array of objects. Each one of those objects has 2 properties, a name and then a fur property, reflecting whether or not these pets have fur. And our PM has said that we need to display that on the page. But we've built a nice reusable dropdown, right, where we can pass templates for our row content. So this should be a requirement that we can meet, right? And so we can. This implicit variable syntax supports property binding. As you can see there in this bottom template, we've added the fur property to our UI. We're displaying whether or not these pets have fur, and we've passed our litmus test for reusability. Our whole data structure has changed under the hood, but our dropdown template component has not changed. You'll notice that this snippet doesn't have the dropdown component in it on this slide, and that's because the dropdown component didn't need to change. So this is a very powerful feature in Angular, but there are a couple of pitfalls to be aware of. The biggest one is type checking in your templates, specifically in the ng templates that you're using for the rows. The implicit variable in Angular is going to always be parsed as an any, even if you type the data type that the implicit variable is being assigned to. So if we type the inputs to our dropdown instead of leaving as an any, Angular will still parse that implicit variable as an any. Doesn't matter if the source data is typed or not. So this can open up some pitfalls for you. If you look on line 4 in that bottom snippet, I'm bound to pet.foo instead of pet.fur, and this will compile and run for you, even though there's technically an error in it. The solution to this this problem is fortunately pretty simple, thanks to Angular and the joys of TypeScript. If you migrate this type-dependent data to a standalone component, then you get type checking where you need it. So instead of having a span in this template, we've refactored this to just be a simple component. And now if we look at the bottom instance here, our type error has successfully been caught. We're throwing an error when we try to access that foo property. And now we have this last little layer of type safety that we're really looking for. This really does open up quite a lot of possibilities. Templates can be passed between components in a way that ng content really does not allow you to do. Ng content can only penetrate one layer of templates, which can definitely be a limiting factor in some scenarios. Templates can be passed around as many layers as you want. This is a really valuable tool for building design systems or building component libraries so that you can work within a design system. A lot of third-party component libraries like AdGrid do this sort of thing under the hood for allowing you to inject custom content into a predefined wrapper of some sort. And I have a question slide here, even though we're doing questions at the end. So I'm going to breeze past this real quick to hit this further reading here. There's a really excellent blog post from somebody from the AdGrid team, actually, who does a really thorough job of explaining this. It's the blog that I used to learn this technique. Definitely worth a read. Angular also has some really good content in their docs on content projection and some more in-depth information on how ng templates work and this like mechanism for passing data between templates. A really interesting little window into Angular and its under the hood processes if that's your kind of thing. We'll open the floor to questions, but that's all I had. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I think we've got just got one question in from Mark, and then I'm gonna say we got no more time because we gotta keep it rolling. Mark asks, how hard is it to make it a standard in a project for UI components?
A standard, I'm leaning towards probably not that hard. It might be a little harder to like refactor existing code for, but it is a pretty easy thing to start building with. So I would say if you were going to go about it like a point forward approach is the way that I would do it, then maybe you could work backwards from there. But it's pretty easy to get up and off the ground, in my opinion.
Awesome, great. And we got another question. If you could share your presentation, if you could throw that in the I think that the handouts tab, you can add your slides. That would be super cool, so folks can take a look and go to those resources you shared. That would be great.